The snow had been falling for 3 days when they brought her to Duskwall. Solvei did not count the hours anymore. She counted other things, the number of guards at each gate, 4, always 4, rotating at the third bell. The depth of the drifts against the eastern wall, chest high by now, impassable. The temperature of the stone beneath her bare feet as they dragged her across the inner courtyard. Cold, but not killing cold, not yet. She had learned to notice such distinctions. The fortress of Duskwall crouched at the edge of the Grimfjord like something the earth had coughed up and regretted. Black stone and older iron, its towers crooked as broken teeth against a sky the color of old pewter. Torches burned in iron cressets at every turn, not for warmth, but to keep the dark back, and the dark here was a living thing. She had felt it the moment the longboat rounded the headland, a heaviness in the air, a pressure behind the eyes, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Her foster uncle Brodvik had sold her to pay a gambling debt. She had known something was wrong for months. The way he stopped meeting her eyes at supper, the messengers who came and went before dawn. She had told herself she was imagining things. She had been wrong. They had come for her on the night of the first true snowfall, 6 wolves in Duskwall livery, polite the way drawn blades are polite. Brodvik had not watched them take her. He had turned his back and poured himself another cup of mead. And that, more than the chains, more than the cold, more than the 3-day sea crossing in the hold of a longship, that was the thing that had broken something in her chest. She had stopped crying on the 2nd day. Grief, she had decided, was a luxury she could not afford. Now she stood in Duskwall's great hall and looked at the man who had purchased her, and she understood, in the deep and wordless way of prey who finally sees the predator clearly, that survival here would require everything she had. Harvik of Duskwall was not what she had expected. She had braced herself for something obvious. Teeth and fury, a brute who wore his cruelty openly. Instead, she found a man who sat in a carved wooden chair as if it were a throne, his iron-gray hair pulled severely back, his face a study in controlled patience. He was not young. She put him at perhaps 50 winters, though something in the stillness of his eyes suggested he had been 50 winters for a very long time. He watched her cross the hall with the focused attention of a man examining an investment. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, remove the chains. His voice was quiet. That was the most alarming thing about it. The absolute absence of effort. The certainty that he had no need to raise it. Men who needed to shout their authority did so because some part of them doubted it. This man had no doubts. The chains came off. Solvei did not rub her wrists. She kept her hands loose at her sides and held his gaze and waited. Harvik rose and descended the 2 steps from his chair to the rush-strewn floor. He walked around her once, slowly, and she felt every nerve in her body screaming to flinch, to step back, to put distance between herself and whatever he represented. She did none of these things. He stopped before her, close enough that she could smell the cold iron and wood smoke that clung to him, and reached out one large hand to draw aside the collar of her traveling cloak, exposing the curve of her left collarbone. The mark. It had been there since birth. A crescent moon, thin as a blade of frost, the exact silver white of new snow in moonlight, resting in the hollow below her throat. Her foster mother had called it pretty. Brodvik had always told her to keep it covered. She had never understood why until this moment. The expression that crossed Harvik's face was not hunger. It was not lust, or triumph, or any of the things she had been bracing herself to see. It was something worse. Recognition. As if he had been waiting for this particular sight for years and years, and finding it was not a surprise but a completion. Good. He said only the one word. He released her collar and stepped back, and addressed the wolf guard at her shoulder. The North Tower chamber. Comfortable, not confining. She is not to be mistreated. He paused, letting his gaze return to hers with the weight of an unsaid threat. She is not to be touched. He turned and walked away. That night, alone in the chamber they gave her, small but dry, with a real fire in the hearth and a sleeping shelf piled with furs, Solvei pressed her hand over the crescent mark and felt, for the first time in her memory, that it was warm. Not feverish. Not painful. warm the way a hearthstone is warm when you have been a long time in the cold. She lay awake until the fire burned to embers, listening to the fortress settle around her, and she did not sleep for a long time. When she finally did, she dreamed of a man standing at a window of dark stone, his hands braced against the sill, his shoulders heaving with some enormous, contained emotion. She could not see his face. She could only see his hands, the white-knuckled grip on the stone, the trembling. And she woke with the inexplicable conviction that somewhere, impossibly far away, someone was desperately afraid for her. She did not know what to do with that feeling. She pressed it down beneath survival and began to plan. 1,000 leagues to the east, in the Ironhold's obsidian spire where the ravens nested and the wind never stopped, Kadrin had not slept in 4 days. His advisors no longer came to him with counsel. They had learned. Wolf had taught them, quietly, with the diplomatic firmness of a man who had served a grief-mad king for 60 years, that certain expressions on Kadrin's face meant the room should empty. Tonight's expression was one of those. He stood at the eastern window with both hands flat on the sill, and he breathed, and he counted the heartbeats he could feel through the incomplete bond like a faint drumming in the marrow of his bones. She was alive. She had been alive, this lifetime, for 20 winters, and that alone was a miracle that had broken him open every morning when he woke to the proof of it, that distant pulse, that small, insistent proof of her continued existence. 5 lifetimes. He had found her in each one. He had been hours too late in 3 of them, and days too late in 2. And each time he had stood over a grave that should not have existed, and felt the bond between them go silent. And each time he had believed, briefly, devastatingly, that the silence would be permanent this time. It never was. Her soul was not the kind that stayed still. It came back, patient and stubborn as the tide, carrying the same mark and the same spirit no matter what the body looked like, no matter what name she'd been given. He had loved her as Lyrelai, in a great hall of white stone, in the first morning of their world. He had loved her as a fisherman's daughter in Roskilde, in the second life that had lasted 8 brief years before fever took her. He had loved her as a tavern girl in Velstrom, as a shepherd's youngest daughter in the high pastures above Ostmark, as a weaver's apprentice in the mountain town of Greyveld. He had loved her dead 5 times. The bond the gods had set between an alpha king and his true mate was not a gentle thing. It was not courtly or poetic. It was marrow-deep, soul-threaded, fundamental, the kind of bond whose incompletion was a constant wound, a nerve exposed to every wind. 300 years of that wound had not made him accustomed to it. It had made him precise. He had learned to put the pain where it could be useful, to burn it as fuel, to let it drive him forward when grief alone would have stopped him. Tonight, something had changed. The pulse through the bond had shifted, sharpened, and then, terrifyingly, changed direction. She had not died. He knew the specific silence of her death with horrible intimacy. This was different. This was distance. She had been moved. He felt it like a compass needle swinging. Wolf. His voice split the silence. The door opened before the echo faded. Wolf had been with him longest of all the Shadow Blades. 60 years of service had not softened him. He was lean and angular and watchful, with the unhurried economy of movement that belonged to men who had survived a great number of things. He came into the room already armed, already reading Kadrin's posture, his amber eyes quick and still at once. She has been taken. Kadrin did not turn from the window. West. Duskwall. A pause. Brief. Controlled. Harvik's territory. Yes. My king. Wolf's voice was careful, the way a man is careful crossing ice of uncertain thickness. If we march on Duskwall without cause, the Council of Alphas will call it aggression. Harvik has 3 allied packs within 3 days' ride. We cannot... I know. Kadrin turned from the window, and Wolf, who had stood at the side of this king for 6 decades and seen him through the grief of 5 losses, went very still. The gold had come into Kadrin's eyes. Not fully, not blazing, but present at the edges like fire seen through a crack in a door. The wolf was pressing at the surface. I know what we cannot do publicly, so we will not do it publicly. His voice had changed register, dropping into the frequency that was less human than not. Send word to the Shadow Network. I want scouts at every approach to Duskwall within 3 days. I want to know the fortress's layout, the guard rotation, the number of wolves within its walls. He crossed to the armor stand and began lifting pieces, moving with the contained precision of long practice. I want to know what she looks like in this life. I want to know if she is injured. I want to know if she is... His hand stopped over the chest plate. I want to know she is alive, he said, quieter. Wolf crossed the room. He picked up the chest plate and fitted it himself, an old gesture from the early decades of his service, and his silence was not absence of feeling, but the specific kind of presence that knows when words would be less than the weight they're meant to carry. We will find her in time, he said at last. You said that in the third life. Kadrin's voice was not accusatory. It was simply honest and therefore devastating. You said it in the fourth. Yes. Wolf buckled the last strap and stepped back and met the gold-edged gray of his king's eyes without flinching. And I will say it again now. Because we are closer than we have ever been. Because she has lived 20 winters in this life, and in every previous one she never lived past 14. Because whatever has been killing her has either failed or been delayed, and that is not nothing, my king. That is everything. Kadrin was silent for a long moment. Then he picked up his sword. Mobilize the shadow blades. We ride by first bell. 2 months in Duskwall had taught Solvei that survival was a craft, and like all crafts, it required patience, observation, and the discipline not to act before the moment was right. She had mapped the fortress in the first week, corridors and storerooms, the servants' passages behind the great hall, the 2 gates, their guards, the gap in the western wall where the stones had settled and the mortar had crumbled to a width a slim woman could squeeze through if the tide were right. She filed each piece of knowledge away carefully and said nothing. Harvick came to her chamber each evening at the 7th bell. He never touched her. He sat in the chair across from the hearth and watched the fire and occasionally asked her things. Where she had grown up, what she knew of her family's history, whether the mark had ever caused her pain. She answered what she chose, withheld what she chose, and watched him with the same careful attention he gave her. He was not a simple man. She had hoped he would be. Simple cruelty she understood and could navigate. What Harvick offered was something more unsettling. The patience of a man who had been waiting for something for a very long time and was in no danger of running out of patience now. Do you know what you are? He asked her on the 23rd evening. She gave him the same answer she had been giving him for 3 weeks. I am a girl from Valdemir who should be at home. Something almost like a smile moved his lips, and he rose and left without another word. The mark had grown warmer. It woke her some nights, not with pain, but with a sensation she had no word for. A fullness just below her collarbone, a heat that pulsed like a second heartbeat. She would lie in the dark with her hand pressed to it and feel, on the edges of sleep, the faintest impression of something vast and searching. Not threatening, not like the heaviness of Duskwall's air. Something else. Something that felt, obscurely, like being looked for. She had told no one. There was only one person in Duskwall she would have trusted with that information. And Era was 14 years old and frightened enough already. The girl had attached herself to Solvei in the 2nd week, appearing each morning with the breakfast tray and a supply of whispered news gathered from the kitchen gossip and the laundry women's conversations. Era had hollow cheeks and enormous dark eyes, and the specific watchfulness of a child who had been small and powerless for long enough to understand that information was the only currency she could afford. There is a king searching for someone, Era whispered one morning, her eyes fixed on the door as she set down the bread and dried fish. An alpha king from the east. The mark flared warm against Solvei's fingers. She pressed it harder. What kind of someone? A woman with a mark. Era's eyes dropped briefly, pointedly, to the hand at Solvei's collarbone, then up again. A silver crescent, they say. He has been burning his way west for months, offering fortunes to anyone who knows where she is. How long? Solvei asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. Since the night of the first snowfall, they say. The night they had taken her from Valdmir. Solvei sat very still and breathed very carefully and said, with great precision, "Tell me everything you know." 3 nights after Era's news, Harvik did not sit down. He came in and crossed directly to where Solvei stood at the window, watching the aurora spread pale green light across the snow, and he gripped her arm with a force she had not felt from him before, controlled but at the edge of it, the way a dam is controlled until it isn't. "You have heard. Not a question." "The servants talk," she said as neutrally as she could manage. "Then I will save time." He released her arm and stepped back. The firelight caught the angles of his face and made him look older, or perhaps simply more himself, the long patience finally giving way to something impatient underneath. The crescent mark appears once in a generation, when the bloodlines of the old moon priest thin enough to concentrate. It marks the reincarnated soul of a woman who was killed 3 centuries ago before she could complete her bond with the first Alpha King of Ironhold. Solvei's throat went dry. "That is a legend," she said. "It is history." His voice was flat, certain. 300 years ago, at the bonding ceremony of King Kadrin and his fated mate, an assassin put a blade through her chest. The king went. He paused, and something moved behind his pale eyes. Something that was not quite contempt and not quite fear. Kadrin did not accept her death. He declared he would wait, that the bond was incomplete, that her soul would return. He looked at her. He has been searching through every reincarnation since. "You are telling me this for a reason," Solvei said. Her voice was steadier than she was. "Because I have been planning for 30 winters," Harvik said. "I knew you would be born eventually. I made your uncle's debts possible. I arranged the timing of your sail to precede Kadrin's scouts by a fortnight." He said it without drama, the way a man reads out accounts. "You are not a prisoner here, Solvei. You are a key." "A key to what?" "To the ruin of the most powerful alpha alive." He moved to the door. "When the blood moon rises in 4 nights, the old claiming ritual can be performed. A bond completed under the blood moon overrides all other bonds, fated or otherwise. When I claim you, Kadrin's 300 years of accumulated power, all the strength that was meant to transfer to him upon completion of the bond will come to me instead." He paused with his hand on the door. "He will arrive, eventually. He always does. But he will arrive to find the bond complete and his power already spent." The door closed. Solvei stood at the window for a long time after. 4 nights. The mark on her collarbone was burning, and in the burning she was almost sure she felt, something answer back. A pulse of warmth that was not her own heartbeat. A presence, enormous and urgent and terrifyingly gentle, pressing at the edges of her awareness the way candlelight presses at the edge of dark. She pressed back, not knowing if she was imagining it. The warmth surged, briefly and overwhelmingly, and then steadied. "I am coming," she thought, not as words exactly, but as a direction, a compass reading. "I am coming." She did not know if she was receiving the thought or sending it. She closed her eyes and breathed, and began to plan in earnest. On the 2nd night before the blood moon, someone tapped on her window. She was not sleeping. She had not been sleeping, had been sitting cross-legged on the sleeping shelf in the fur-draped dark, turning her knowledge of the fortress over and over in her mind, looking for the one combination of timing and circumstance that led somewhere other than the altar. The tap was quiet, precise. Not wind, not a bird. She was at the window before the 2nd tap sounded. A face outside. A man younger than she'd expected, lean and dark-haired, clinging to the sheer tower wall with the casual confidence of someone who'd done this before. His amber eyes were intent and urgent. He gestured with one hand. "Open it." She studied him for 2 full seconds. The dark-stained leather, the silver pin at his collar in the shape of a crescent within thorns, and opened the window. He came through without a sound, cat-smooth, and straightened to his full height in her firelit chamber, and looked at her with an expression that was half desperate relief and half the professional focus of a man who had a job to do and limited time to do it. "Wolf," he said, voice barely above a breath. "Third shadow blade of the Ironhold Guard. I have been searching for you for 4 years in this territory alone." His amber eyes went to the mark at her collarbone, visible in the low-cut neck of the sleeping shift they'd given her, and something moved in his face. Reverence, she thought, or something close to it. "My lady." "Do not call me that," she said. "Tell me what I need to know." He almost smiled. "Kadrin said you would be direct." "Kadrin has never met me. He knows you better than you know yourself. Across 5 lifetimes. He moved to the door, pressed his ear to the iron, and listened for a count of 10 before turning back. His voice dropped lower. "Harvik's plan is older and more elaborate than you've been told. He has not been acting alone. There is a woman, Lady Sigra of House Vendel, who has been coordinating the interference since before Harvik was born. It was her assassin who killed your first incarnation. It was her agents who arranged every subsequent death. Harvik is her instrument." The cold moved through Solvei's chest slowly, like ice cracking in a river. "Why? What does she want?" Wolf's jaw tightened. "She was Kadrin's betrothed. Before Lirelei, before your first life. A political arrangement of extraordinary power. When the fated bond superseded it, she was cast aside." He met Solvei's eyes. "She has spent 3 centuries killing you in the hope that Kadrin would eventually give up and return to her." The silence stretched between them. "He never did," Solvei said, not a question. "He never looked at another woman." Wolf's voice was quiet. "Not in 300 years. He has spent every moment of it searching." He paused. "In 4 years of working this territory, I have sent him reports of your movements, your health. I think—" He stopped himself. "You should know that your mark is not the only reason he is coming. He knows you in ways he cannot fully explain. He knows your courage. He knows the shape of your spirit from 5 lifetimes of brief, stolen glimpses. A sound in the corridor. Wolf went still. After a moment, it passed. "I cannot take you tonight," he said, moving to the window. "The wards on this tower are set to Harvik's scent. If you leave without his knowledge, every wolf in Duskwall wakes within seconds." He looked at her with an expression that was entirely serious. "Tomorrow night, I return with 2 others. The wards can be overwhelmed from 3 angles simultaneously. You will have perhaps 4 minutes to reach the eastern postern before the guard rotation changes." He held her gaze. "Be ready." He swung a leg over the windowsill and paused. "He has loved you through 5 deaths," Wolf said, as if he couldn't quite help himself. "I have served him for 60 years, and I can tell you, he has loved you through each one of them. And each loss has carved him a little more down to the bone. And he is still standing. And he is coming." His voice was rough. "Whatever you feel when you think about him, whatever that burning mark is telling you, it is not wrong." He dropped from the window and was gone. Solvei sat on the edge of the sleeping shelf and pressed both palms to her face and breathed. "Tomorrow night." She pressed her fingers to the crescent mark and felt it respond, warm, steady, certain. She let herself feel it. Let herself follow the warmth outward to its source, that distant, enormous presence, and she did something she had not done in 20 winters of existence. She stopped being afraid. He came back the following evening, as promised, but he was not alone. There were 3 deep cuts across his forearm, wrapped in a strip of linen that was already seeping through, and his dark hair was plastered to his temple with cold sweat. He came through the window and caught himself on the sill with one hand, and Solvei was across the room before he straightened. "It is nothing," he said. "It is very obviously something, She took his arm without asking, turned it to the firelight, and unwound the makeshift bandage. The cuts were long, but not deep. Claws, she thought. 3 parallel lines from wrist to elbow, fresh enough to still be bleeding freely. She found the basin and cloth. He stood and let her work, which told her more about the injury than any words. Wolf did not strike her as a man who accepted help easily. "One of the perimeter wolves recognized me," he said, keeping his voice low. "It is handled, but the guard rotation has shifted. We have a shorter window tonight." "How much shorter?" 2 minutes instead of 4. She pressed the cloth against the deepest cut and held it there. The fire crackled. The wind outside moved through the tower stones with a sound like breathing. She was very aware of the small distance between them, of the heat from the wound against her fingers, of the way he was watching her with an expression that was carefully professional and almost managing it. "He is 3 days out," Wolf said, "with 40 shadow blades. He rode light for speed." He paused. "He will arrive too late for the ritual. We both know that. The plan is not to wait for him. It is to get you out before the altar and let him arrive to an empty cage." "And if we fail?" Wolf was quiet for a moment. "Then he tears this fortress apart stone by stone. He has done it before." His voice was very level. "He has done many things I would have thought impossible if I had not watched him do them. Grief on that scale either breaks a man or forges something else entirely." She tied the fresh bandage and released his arm. He flexed his fingers, testing, and nodded once. "Thank you. Thank me when we are outside the walls." She looked up and found him closer than she'd registered, his amber eyes at a level with hers, and there was a beat of silence that was not quite comfortable and not quite anything else. The particular quality of silence between two people who are both, for different reasons, very carefully not saying something. "You are not what I expected," he said finally. "I am never what people expect," she said. "My king's words exactly." Something brief and warm moved through his expression. "He said it the 3rd time he found you. Too late that time, but he had managed 2 days before the end. He said your name meant sun voice in the old tongue, and you had introduced yourself to him as no one special in the same sentence." His voice softened. "He has told me that story 100 times." The mark burned, sudden and sweet. "Come," Wolf said, and the professional focus was back. "We have a window." They almost made it. Solvei was 3 strides from the postern gate, Wolf at her shoulder, the cold, clean air of the fjord flooding her lungs for the first time in 2 months, when Harvik's voice came from above. "I wondered how long before Kadrin's shadow hounds reached my walls." He stepped off the battlements as if gravity were optional, a 20-foot drop that he absorbed with the ease of a man stepping over a threshold, and landed in the snow before the gate with 4 wolves spreading to either side. He looked at Solvei with something she now recognized as what had always been beneath the patience. Anger, old and deep as bedrock. "You were meant to wait," he said, quietly, always quietly. 2 more nights. That was all that was needed. "I did not agree to wait," Solvei said. "You did not have to agree." He gestured to the wolves and they moved, and Wolf moved to meet them, with the cold economy of a man who has fought worse and survived it. But there were 4, and he was already injured, and Solvei saw the moment the arithmetic became unfavorable. "Stop," she said. Everyone stopped. She looked at Wolf. He looked back at her with an expression that was eloquent and furious and helpless. "Go," she said. "Tell him where I am. Tell him to come with everything." "My lady, go." She kept her voice steady through an act of will she would never fully be able to describe. "Do not make his sacrifice meaningless by dying in the snow 50 feet from the gate." Wolf stood frozen for 3 full seconds. Then he threw himself sideways, over the wall, into the dark. Gone before Harvik's wolves could fully react, a black shape absorbed by the night and the fjord wind. Harvik watched the darkness where he had disappeared. "Clever," he said, almost admiringly. Then to Solvei. "The ritual moves to tonight. The blood moon is close enough. We will not wait for the perfect alignment. His gray eyes came to hers. You have cost me time I did not want to lose. She said nothing. He took her arm, not bruising precisely, but unequivocal, and walked her back through the gate. Inside the corridor, with the snow sound closed off and the torchlight thick around them, she felt the mark flare with sudden hot urgency. Not the gentle warmth of the past weeks. This was alarm. This was, she thought for one vertiginous moment, this was him. Kadrin. Feeling the bond shift, feeling her fear through it, the incomplete connection straining like a rope pulled taut between two moving objects. She pressed her hand to the mark and pushed back through it. I am here. I am alive. Come quickly. She did not know if it reached him. She only knew, in the marrow-deep way that had no rational explanation, that it did. The ritual chamber was below the foundation stones, carved from living rock, and the altar at its center was ancient enough that the surface had been worn smooth by centuries of use. The air tasted of iron and old power, the specific stale quality of a space where a great deal of intention had been focused for a very long time. They bound Solvei's wrists to the altar stone with wolfsbane threaded chains. The burn was immediate and constant, a low-grade fire along her skin. She breathed through it. Harvick arranged the ritual implements with the careful efficiency of a man who had been preparing for this moment for 30 years. Torches at the cardinal points. A curved blade of dark iron. A bowl of something that smelled of pine resin and copper. And then, because she had not known about this, had not been able to account for it, they brought in Era. The girl was white-faced and shaking, held between two wolves who were each twice her size. Her enormous dark eyes found Solvei immediately and filled with tears. For each minute you resist, Harvick said, I will find a reason to cause this child discomfort. His voice was as quiet as it had ever been. She is not important to me. You are. Cooperate with the ritual willingly, and she goes free when it is finished. Solvei looked at Era. Era looked back. Her chin was lifted, despite the tears. Her jaw was set with the particular expression of someone who is terrified and determined not to show it, and failing somewhat at both. She looked, Solvei thought, with a sharp and unexpected surge of feeling, exactly like someone who had decided to be brave, even though bravery was very clearly costing her. She thought of Lyrelei, the name that floated up from the dreams, from the mark, from 5 lifetimes of accumulated self. A woman who had been a moon priestess before she was a king's maid. A woman who had known that power, true power, did not consume the people it should protect. Something stirred in Solvei's chest. Not the bond, not Kadrin's presence, though she could feel that too, closer than it had ever been, a brightness expanding behind her collarbone like the sun before it clears the tree line. This was something older, something that had been accumulating through 5 deaths and 5 rebirths, growing denser with each cycle the way snowpack grows denser over winter. Compressed, concentrated, waiting for the season that would finally let it move. The crescent mark blazed. Harvick looked up sharply. The wolfsbane chains began to smoke. What? He stepped forward, and the silver light pouring from Solvei's mark struck him like a physical force, and he staggered back, his gray eyes wide for the first time in her experience of him. The patience finally broken, replaced by something she recognized at last as fear.
The moon priestess line was never simply a bloodline trait,
Solvei said, and her voice resonated with frequencies she didn't fully understand, multiple harmonics layered beneath the ordinary sound of it. The chains cracked apart, link by link. She sat up.
It was a power that was meant to be completed, not stolen, not claimed by force, not transferred through ritual violence.
She looked at Era. Let her go. Harvick's wolves hesitated. Let her go, Solvei said again, and this time the silver light swept outward in a wave, gentle as breath around the girl and the wolves. Released her and stepped back without quite knowing why. Era ran to the chamber's far wall and pressed herself against the stone and watched with huge eyes. Harvick drew the ceremonial blade. This changes nothing, he said. The steadiness of his voice cost him something. She could see it, the effort of it, the way his grip on the blade was too tight.
The power in you is useless without the bond's completion. It will burn itself out in minutes.
You have never wielded it before. You do not know how to sustain it. You are right, Solvei said. I have never wielded it before. She got to her feet on the altar stone. But she has. The silver fire exploded outward, not violently, not a weapon, not an attack. It poured out of her like light through a cracked door, filling the chamber from floor to ceiling, and where it touched the walls it illuminated carvings that hadn't been visible in torchlight. Figures of women with crescent marks, drawn in the style of 3 centuries ago. More. It touched Era and she gasped, not in pain, but in the way people gasp when they step into sunlight after a long time underground. Harvick charged. He was very fast, very powerful, and the blade was aimed with the precision of a man who had done this before, in other lifetimes, under other arrangements. Something in Solvei moved without thought, older than thought, Lorelai's body memory guiding her hands as she caught his wrist with both of hers, redirected the force, and drove her elbow into his jaw with the compact efficiency of someone who had been trained for this in a previous existence she was only now remembering. Harvick hit the chamber floor. He was not dead. The silver fire surrounded him in a close burning ring, and he lay within it looking up at her with something that was not quite defeat. It was more complicated than defeat, layered, an expression that had 30 years of planning behind it. And for a moment, she almost felt sorry for him. "You will not survive this," he said. "Sigra is coming. She has 500 wolves. She built me from the ground up for this moment, and when I fail, she comes herself." "I know," Solvei said. She had heard it through the bond. Kadrin, 2 hours out now, racing with everything he had. She had felt his alarm when the silver fire ignited, and then, through the bond, something that felt like awe. "Hold on," it said. "Hold on. I am almost there." "I know," she sent back, through the mark, through whatever channel the incomplete bond had opened between them. "I am all right, but she is coming behind you." He came through the eastern wall. Not the gate, the wall itself, at the point where the stones had been weakened by 3 centuries of frost shift, and she had noted in her second week, the gap that was not yet passage-wide, but would be with enough force. He came through in his wolf form, which was... She had tried to prepare herself, had received some impression through the bond, had believed she understood, nothing like what she was prepared for. She had expected something large, powerful. She had not expected the specific quality of presence he carried. Not threat, but gravity. The way a mountain has presence, the way deep water does. She had not expected the way every wolf in Duskwall's courtyard, Harvick's wolves, wolves who had lived their entire lives in a fortress built on brutality, stepped back without being asked. He shifted between one breath and the next, man from wolf, and he was across the courtyard before she had fully registered the movement. And then he stopped, 3 feet away, close enough that she could see the details her dreams had never managed to supply. The specific gray-black of his eyes, the hard angles of his face, the way 300 years of sustained grief had carved something spare and precise from what might once have been merely handsome. He was younger than she'd expected. She didn't know why that surprised her. He was older than anyone she'd ever met. She didn't know how both things could be true simultaneously, but they were. He looked at her. She looked back. The bond between them was a live thing. She could feel it. They both could, pulling at the space between them with the insistence of tide, every incomplete thread straining toward connection. "Solvei," he said. The way he said her name was nothing like the way anyone else ever had. It was the way you say the name of something you thought you had lost. "Kadrin," she said. They stood there, wolf, somewhere behind his king. She registered him at the edge of her vision. Coughed quietly into his fist, which was either a signal or a strongly implied suggestion, and Kadrin crossed the remaining distance and cupped her face in both hands, and she felt, through the contact, through the mark, through the bond that was not yet complete but was straining toward it with everything it had, 300 years of it, all at once, not painful, just fast. "You are real," he said. It came out rough-edged, not the voice of a king, the voice of a man who has been believing in something for 300 years and finally touched it. every lifetime I have arrived to find. I know, she said. She reached up and put her hands over his. I remember some of it. Enough! Something moved in his face. The gray-black of his eyes was warming at the edges. The gold she had read about coming in, slow and golden dawn inevitable. Sigra is coming, Wolf said from behind them. And the moment the words landed, Solvei felt it. The advance edge of something enormous and dark moving from the east. 500 wolves at least. The specific pressure of organized malice. The bond flared with it. Kadrin felt it too, his hands tightening briefly on her face before he released her and turned. How long? An hour, perhaps less. We cannot fight 500 with 40, Solvei said. No. Kadrin looked at her, and there was something in his expression that she was going to have a great deal of time to learn to read. The layered quality of it, very old and very focused. But you are not the only thing that has been accumulating power for 300 years. Lady Sigra of House Findel arrived at the first light of dawn, and she was magnificent in the way that terrible things can be magnificent. The silver of her hair arranged in the elaborate coils of a formal arrival. Her wolves deployed in arcing ranks across the snow. Her bearing the specific uprightness of a woman who has been preparing for a moment for her entire life. She rode to the center of the courtyard on a gray horse and looked at the fortress before her. Gates standing open, Harvick's wolves gathered in a loose, unhappy cluster to one side. 40 shadow blades arrayed at careful intervals. And then at Kadrin, standing at the courtyard's center. And then at Solvei beside him, and her expression shifted through several things very quickly before settling on something controlled and cold. So, she said, we have arrived at the end of the story at last. There is no story, Kadrin said. There is only what you chose, 3 centuries ago and every year since. Sigra descended from the horse without assistance, her silk and fur traveling cloak moving around her like water, and walked toward them with the absolute confidence of a woman surrounded by 500 wolves. I made choices that should have given me everything. You made choices that denied me everything. Her silver eyes found Solvei's. You do not even know what you are. You are a vessel for power that was never meant for you. A lucky accident of bloodline, a soul that keeps surviving through sheer stubbornness when it should have learned to give way. I know what I am, Solvei said. She felt, distantly, the silver fire still warm beneath her sternum, banked but not extinguished, patient as embers. I am what 300 years of your attempts to erase me have made. Every death you arranged, every life you cut short. The power didn't dissipate, it returned with the soul. You spent 3 centuries making me stronger. Something flickered behind Sigra's cultured stillness. The ritual is not how it works. Solvei took a step forward. Behind her, she felt Kadrin shift, not to stop her, but to position himself, 1 step to her left, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him even through the cold. Present, steady, not in front of her, not pulling her back, beside her. The Moon Priestess bond does not transfer like property. It does not complete under force or violence. It completes through choice. She felt the silver fire stir in response to her voice. I choose him. I have always chosen him. That is the thing you could never manufacture or replace. Not with 300 years of assassins, not with blood moon rituals, not with anything you had. Sigra's face cracked. Beneath the long patience and the silk and the elaborate architecture of 3 centuries of scheming, there was something raw and grieving and old, and Solvei, to her own surprise, felt something other than hatred for it, a kind of recognition. Loss did this to people sometimes. It metastasized. It was always supposed to be me, Sigra said, and for a moment she sounded less like an enemy and more like someone who had loved something and lost it and never recovered. We were matched before she existed. Our bond should have been. There was no bond, Kadrin said from beside Solvei. His voice was level, not cruel. I cared for you. I respected the match our fathers had arranged. But there was no bond, Sigra. There was never a bond. What you have been fighting to destroy was the only real thing I have ever had, and you have spent 3 centuries making it cost more than you will ever understand." Silence. Then Sigra's composure collapsed in a single visible instant. 3 centuries of control gone in the time it takes to exhale, and she reached into her cloak for the knife that was always, always there. The silver fire took her before the blade was halfway out. Not to kill, not to punish in any way that left blood on the snow. It poured from Solvei's mark in a bright, controlled arc, and it surrounded Sigra the way it had surrounded the chamber, and it did what Moon Priestess power does when it has been patient long enough. It showed her the truth. The wolves around the perimeter stepped back. Some ran. The ones who had served Sigra by choice rather than threat stood frozen, watching their mistress collapse to her knees in the silver light, her face working through expressions that had no names. What Solvei showed her was not punishment. It was 300 years of everything Sigra had destroyed. Not as accusation, as simple fact. 5 lifetimes of a girl who kept coming back, who kept loving, who kept surviving. A king who kept searching, who never stopped, who wore the lost like iron and still chose every morning to continue. The things that had been stolen. Not just the bonding ceremonies, not just the years together, the ordinary moments, the breakfasts, the arguments about insignificant things, the ordinary warmth of being known completely by one other person in the world. The things Sigra had spent 3 centuries denying them. When it ended, Sigra was on both knees in the snow, and the silver fire had released her. And she stayed there, looking at nothing, her silver hair undone and falling around her face. She was not dead. She was, in some specific way, finished. Wolf stepped forward. The shadow blades moved. Sigra's wolves, to a man, lowered their heads. Solvei turned to Kadrin. He was looking at her with an expression she had no prior experience to interpret. Entirely new to her, entirely clear, and she thought she understood it anyway. The way you understand some things without having been taught them. "Sacred ground," he said, very quietly, referencing something she understood from the dreams, from Lyralee's memories, the traditional requirement. She looked at the courtyard around them, the silver fire fading in the snow, the dawn coming over the fjord in shades of rose and pale gold, the ancient stone of Duskwall's walls clean and bare in the early light. "The silver fire has been through every stone of this place," she said. "It is as clean as it has ever been." She reached up and touched the mark at her collarbone, then placed her palm flat against his chest, where she could feel the mirror mark burning warm through the fabric. "I do not want to wait any longer." Something shifted in his face. The gold came fully into his eyes. "Neither do I," he said. "I have not wanted to wait since the first lifetime." He tilted his head. She rose to her toes, the bond completed with the dawn. The coronation was held in Ironhold's Great Hall, where 300 years ago a woman named Lyralee had died in the arms of the man who became a legend for his refusal to accept that she was gone. Solvei stood before the white stone throne in silver and amber, Kadrin at her left side, and felt the weight of all 5 previous lives in her bones like a kind of inheritance. Everything those women had survived, everything they had carried forward, deposited here, in this morning, in this breathing body, in the quiet fact of a mark on her collarbone that had burned warm ever since she first felt him searching through it. The hall held more wolves than she had words for. They came from every direction of the compass, old enemies standing at careful distance from old enemies, united by nothing more or less than the specific gravity of a story reaching its ending. Wolf stood in the second row with his arm still bandaged and an expression of profound relief that he was working very hard to contain behind professional composure and failing somewhat in the way she had come to recognize as his version of joy. Era stood in the third row, slightly behind the Valdmere delegation, wearing the livery of an Ironhold house servant and looking around the hall with the bright, specific attention of someone who intends to remember everything. Harvick was in the detention towers. That question would take longer to resolve. The Council of Alphas, the evidence of 3 centuries of conspiracy, the careful work of justice. Solvei had declined to attend those proceedings. She had said what she needed to say. The rest was not her weight to carry. She had other things to carry now. The High Priestess. the first to hold that title since Larralee's death, raised the circlet of moonstone and amber. "What was broken," she said, her young voice steady in the vast space, "is mended. What was lost is found. What was stolen across 5 lifetimes and 3 centuries has been reclaimed by the souls it always belonged to." She placed the silver circlet on Solvei's head. "Long live the Queen," the hall answered. Afterward, in the quiet that followed the celebration, very late, when the torches had burned to their sockets and the last of the wolves had found their sleeping places, Kadrin found her at the eastern window of the obsidian spire, looking out at the fjord. He had been looking for her, she knew, through the bond that ran between them now like a clear stream, quiet and constant. He came to stand behind her, and after a moment, he put his arm around her shoulders, the way you put an arm around something you have been afraid of losing for a very long time. "I keep waiting," she said, "to wake up, to find myself back in Duskwall in the cold." "I know." His voice was quiet against the crown of her head. "I've been afraid of the same thing every morning for 3 centuries. I have decided to stop being afraid of it." "How?" He turned her, gently, to face him. His gray-black eyes were gold at the edges, as they were often now when he looked at her. The wolf's color, the bond's color. His hands on her shoulders were warm. He was real in the specific way that only things you have almost lost can be real, with all their surfaces present, with all their weight. "I touch you," he said, "every morning. Whatever I am afraid of losing, I touch it, and it is here." She reached up and put her hand over the mark on his throat, the mirror crescent that had burned there since she had set it, dawn golden and permanent, and felt the bond hum warm beneath her fingers. "Every morning," she agreed. Outside, the fjord caught the last of the moon's light and threw it back in silver pieces. Inside, in the old tower that had watched centuries pass and had one more story to hold, the Alpha King and his twice-ancient mate stood at the window and were not afraid, and were not parted, and were not anything other than what they had always been to each other, inevitable. Whole. Home. The first ordinary morning was the strangest thing that had ever happened to Kadrin. He had lived through 300 years of extraordinary things. He had survived wars, councils, the cold mathematics of 5 incomplete losses. He had learned to exist in the space between searching and finding, had made a discipline out of the suspended breath of not yet, but coming. Extraordinary things, he knew how to survive. This, Solvei asleep beside him in the gray pre-dawn light, her dark hair loose across the pillow, her breathing slow and even, the crescent mark on her collarbone a faint silver warmth in the dimness. This he did not know what to do with at all. He lay very still and watched her breathe. The bond between them hummed with that quiet constancy he was still learning to trust, the sound of something complete rather than straining. No distance, no muffled pulse felt through 1,000 leagues of cold. Just this, her heart beat through it like a clear note held steady, warm as hearthstone, real as the morning pressing at the shutters. She moved in her sleep, tucking closer, and his arm tightened around her without his giving it instruction. His body had opinions about this, evidently, that preceded thought. 300 years, some part of him thought, not in grief for once, but in something closer to disbelief. For this. For her eyelashes against her cheek. For the particular way she had of occupying sleep, as if it were territory she had assessed and decided to hold. For the fact that outside this room there was an entire fortress preparing for an ordinary day. The kitchens firing, the guard rotations changing, Wolf almost certainly already at his desk with a cup of something hot and a pile of correspondence. And none of it required Kadrin's attention yet, not for 1 hour more. Not until the light through the shutters shifted from gray to gold. He had an hour of this. He found he could not decide what to do with an hour of this. Solvei solved the problem by opening one eye. "You're watching me," she said, voice rough with sleep. "Yes." "Why?" He considered telling her, the full weight of it, the 300 years condensed to this single extraordinary, ordinary moment. But he had learned, through Wolf's reports across 4 years of knowing her indirectly and several concentrated months of knowing her directly, that Solvei did not need the weight. She already carried it. She had been born carrying it, every reincarnation arriving with the accumulated freight of the previous ones pressed somewhere beneath her sternum, and she had always handled that weight with the same direct practicality she brought to everything else. So instead, he said, "You make interesting faces when you sleep." Both eyes opened. "I do not." "You do. There was one a moment ago that suggested strong opinions about something." "Lies." She pushed herself upright and her hair fell across her face, and she shoved it back with the irritated efficiency of someone who had woken up with opinions about hair her entire life. The crescent mark was warm gold in the growing light. She looked at him, and the expression she wore was the one he was slowly learning to read, the one that looked like exasperation at the surface, and underneath was something it seemed to cost her something to let show. Warmth. Simple. Complicated. 20 winters and 3 centuries warmth. "You did it again," she said. "What?" "The face. The one where you look at me like I am—" She stopped herself, then continued with the directness that was, he had decided, one of his favorite things about her. "Like I might not be here tomorrow." He was quiet for a moment. "Old habit," he said. She turned fully to face him, sitting cross-legged among the furs, and she took both his hands in hers with the matter-of-fact tenderness that was entirely hers, nothing courtly about it, nothing performed, just the plain confidence of a woman who had decided something and was acting on the decision. "I am here today," she said. "Yes." "And I will be here tomorrow, and the day after that." Her thumbs moved over his knuckles. "I know you know that. I know the bond tells you that every morning." She looked up. "I am telling you too because I think you need to hear it from me specifically and not from the bond." He looked at her. 300 years of searching, and she had found the exact thing he needed to hear in his second week of having her, and offered it with the same practical directness she brought to everything. It occurred to him, not for the first time, not for the last, that every previous lifetime he had arrived too late to see this part. The daily part. The part where she was simply herself, unhurried, unthreatened, doing the quiet work of being known. This is the part, he thought, that I have never had before. "I know," he said, and then, because she deserved the full truth, "I am still learning to believe it." Something moved in her face. She unfolded herself and leaned over and pressed her forehead to his, and they stayed there. The mark warm between them, the bond warm between them, the morning coming in through the shutters in slow gold increments. "Then we practice," she said, "every morning, until you believe it. That could take some time." "I have time." He pulled back just far enough to see her face. Her eyes were gray and direct and entirely certain, and beneath the certainty was that thing he had only been able to feel through the bond before now. The depth of her. The soul that had come back 5 times because it was not the kind of soul that stayed still. The spirit that had introduced itself to him as no one special in the same sentence as her name. "You know," he said, "in 300 years, I never. If you are about to say something overwhelming, I would like to be warned. It is not overwhelming. Everything about you is overwhelming." He almost smiled. It happened more frequently now, the almost smiling. Wolf had noted it with an expression of profound relief, as if a natural law had been restored. "I was going to say that I never imagined this part." "What part?" "The ordinary part." He looked at the light on the walls, the furs on the sleeping shelf, her hair still in mild civil conflict with her shoulder. "I imagined finding you. I imagined the completion. I did not imagine breakfast. Arguments about inconsequential things. What you look like in the morning." She was quiet for a moment. "And?" she said. He reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and felt through the bond the way she softened at the gesture, even as her face kept its composure, and he thought of 5 lifetimes of arriving too late and a 6th lifetime that had finally, an extraordinary cost, arrived exactly on time.
And it is the best part,
he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, you are going to make this very difficult to be sensible about. I have been trying to be sensible for 300 years. I am told I was not particularly successful. Wolf told me, in some detail. She stood, pulling a fur around her shoulders, and moved to the window. She pushed the shutter open, and morning light came into the room like something patient that had been waiting, and she stood in it with her hand on the frame and looked out at the fjord. He came to stand behind her. He put his arm around her, her back warm against his chest, the mark beneath his hand humming gold and quiet. Below them, the fjord caught the morning light in silver fragments. The mountains were blue-gray at their tops, bare-rocked and old. A single bird crossed the gap of sky above the battlements and was gone. Solvei leaned back against him, just slightly, the way you lean into something you have finally decided to trust with your weight. Every morning, she said. Every morning, he agreed. Outside, the world went on being ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure. And in the tower, at the top of the Ironhold's obsidian spire, the Alpha King held his 3 centuries distant mate in the new light of an uncountable morning, and was not afraid, and was not waiting, and was, at last, in the marrow-deep, irreversible way that mattered, home.